You start learning something new. You are motivated, you watch the tutorials, you take the notes, you tell yourself, this time is different. For a few days, maybe even a few weeks, you show up, you are consistent. Then something shifts. You sit down to practice, and the energy just is not there. You open the material and somehow end up somewhere else entirely. Eventually, the course sits unfinished, the book stays half-read, and a quiet voice inside you says, maybe I'm just not the kind of person who follows through. Sound familiar? Here's what I want you to hold on to before anything else. That is not laziness. That is not a discipline problem. That is not a character flaw. That is a strategy problem. And strategy is something you can change. In this video, I'm going to walk you through what I call the micro-mastery method, a way of building real skill that works with your brain instead of against it. It draws from some of the most important work done in learning psychology, and once you understand how it works, burnout doesn't just become manageable, it becomes almost structurally impossible. But before we get to the method, I need to talk about something that most learning advice completely skips, the reason you burned out in the first place. The quiet frustration. Picture this. You've been working on something for 2 or 3 weeks. Spanish, maybe, or coding, or writing, or guitar. In the beginning, progress felt obvious. You could see it, feel it, measure it. But somewhere around week 3, progress goes quiet. You practice the same things, and nothing seems to click the way it used to. You're not getting worse, but you're not getting obviously better either. And that silence, that plateau, feels like failure. So you push harder. You add more hours. You buy the better course. You try a different teacher. And when that doesn't immediately produce results, something inside you starts to quietly give up. Not dramatically. You don't quit in one loud moment. You just drift. Sessions get shorter. Then they get skipped. Then the whole project becomes something you'll get back to one day when things are less busy. Here's what society tends to do with that story. It turns it into a story about you, about your willpower, your commitment, your maturity. There is an entire industry built around telling you that you simply didn't want it badly enough, that your problem is mindset, that the people who succeed just work harder than you do. And I want to gently push back on that, because that story is not just unhelpful, it's scientifically inaccurate. Dismantling the myths. There's a long-standing myth about talent, the idea that the people who learn quickly are simply born with an advantage, and the rest of us have to compensate through sheer effort. This myth feels true because we see the finished product of someone's skill and we compare it to our own messy beginning. We don't see the years of invisible work behind their fluency. We just see the gap and assume it's genetic. Howard Gardner spent decades challenging this. His work on multiple intelligences was not just a polite attempt to make everyone feel included. It was a serious argument that human beings carry different cognitive profiles, that some people think in movement, some in sound, some in language, some in spatial systems, and that a single, narrow definition of intelligence would always produce a long list of people who appeared to fail simply because they were being measured on the wrong dimension. Most learning systems, though, still operate on that narrow dimension. They reward speed, compliance, and performance under pressure. And when someone does not thrive under those conditions, we call it a motivation problem. There is a related myth about discipline, the idea that learning is fundamentally a test of character, that if you want it enough, you will wake up early and grind through the discomfort every single day. This idea is appealing because it makes mastery feel moral. It makes the person who succeeds feel virtuous and the person who struggles feel weak. But Benjamin Bloom, one of the most important educational researchers of the 20th century, discovered something that quietly dismantles this story. When students received high-quality, individualized instruction, when the teaching actually matched the learner, something remarkable happened. The performance gap between so-called talented students and average students nearly disappeared. not because the average student suddenly became more disciplined, but because the conditions of learning finally made sense to them. Think about what that means. It means the failure was never really inside the student. It was in the system. It was in the mismatch between the method and the mind. Now I want to talk about what is actually happening in your brain when you burn out from learning. Because once you see it clearly, the whole thing starts to feel less personal. Your brain has a processing limit, not because it is weak, but because it is efficient. When you encounter something new, your working memory, the part of your mind that is actively holding and manipulating information, has to work hard. Everything is unfamiliar. Everything requires conscious attention. Cognitive scientists call this cognitive load, but the experience of it is something you already know. It is that slightly exhausted, slightly foggy feeling you get after 2 or 3 hours of trying to understand something genuinely difficult. The mistake most learners make is treating that feeling as a sign to push through. In reality, that feeling is your brain asking for consolidation time. It is not weakness, it is the process. Memories are not formed during learning. They are formed during rest, during the quiet hours after learning, when your brain replays, organizes, and anchors what you gave it. If you never give your brain that space, you end up rehearsing the same surface-level information repeatedly without it ever sinking deeper. There is something else worth understanding here. When you switch from a focused learning session to checking messages or scrolling, your attention does not fully come back when you return. Researchers call this attention residue. A portion of your focus stays attached to whatever you just did. So each interruption compounds. By the end of a fragmented learning session, you may have technically spent 2 hours studying, but your brain has experienced something much shorter and much shallower. The frustration that follows is real, but it was created by the structure, not you. So, what does a better structure look like? The micro-mastery method is built on a deceptively simple idea that consistent small exposures done at the edge of your current understanding compound into real skill faster and with far less suffering than long grinding sessions that exhaust you and hollow out your motivation. Think of it like gardening. You don't grow something by pouring a month's worth of water on it all at once. You water it consistently, in the right amount, and then you leave it alone to grow. The growth happens in the soil, in the dark, between your visible efforts. Mastery works the same way.
The first layer of the method is what I call threshold sessions. Instead of sitting down for 2 or 3 hours at a time, you work in focused blocks of 25 to 40 minutes, not because of some rigid rule, but because your working memory's natural capacity operates in roughly that window before it begins to fatigue. You stop before you hit the wall. You end the session while you still feel capable. This is important because the feeling you carry away from a session shapes whether you come back tomorrow. Ending on capability rather than exhaustion trains your brain to associate learning with competence rather than suffering. The second layer is deliberate micro-goals. This is where Bloom's work becomes practical. Instead of sitting down to simply practice, you arrive at each session with one specific, narrow thing you are trying to understand or do slightly better than yesterday. Not a vague intention like being better at Spanish, but something precise. Understanding one particular verb conjugation, or hearing the difference between 2 similar chords, or writing a single clean paragraph with a clear argument. The narrower the target, the more signal your brain receives when you hit it. And that signal, that small, honest moment of clarity, is what neuroplasticity actually runs on. The third layer is spaced return. After a focused session, you step away completely. No reviewing, no recapping, no immediate repetition. Then, at growing intervals, a day later, 3 days later, a week later, you return to the same material and try to recall or apply it before restudying it. This is not a study hack, it is a memory architecture principle. When you force your brain to retrieve something slightly difficult, you strengthen the neural pathway that holds it. The mild struggle of remembering is the signal that tells your brain this information matters. Keep it accessible. The fourth layer, and perhaps the quietest one, is identity anchoring. William James wrote over a century ago that the greatest revolution of his generation was the discovery that human beings could alter their lives by altering their attitudes. What he was pointing at, in the language of his time, was something modern psychology now calls identity-based habit formation. When you begin to see yourself as someone who learns rather than someone trying to learn, the behavior stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like an expression. You do not have to convince yourself to go to the gym every day if going to the gym is simply what you do. The same is true here. There is a question worth sitting with quietly. Not to answer right now, but to hold. When you think about the thing you most want to learn, the skill, the subject, the craft, ask yourself honestly, what are you really trying to become? Not achieve, not prove, become. Because sometimes what we call procrastination is actually something more nuanced. It is the gap between who we are and who the skill would require us to be. And closing that gap feels threatening, even when we want it. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the difference between motion and action, between appearing busy and actually moving forward. He was talking about leadership, but it maps perfectly here. Many of us spend enormous energy on the performance of learning, collecting resources, building the perfect system, setting up the ideal environment, because preparation feels safer than the honest exposure of trying and not yet being good. That is not a character flaw, it is human. Carl Jung would probably say it's the psyche protecting itself from the vulnerability of becoming something new. The protection is intelligent, but at some point, the protection becomes the obstacle. The micro-mastery method is effective not just because it reduces cognitive load or leverages spaced repetition, though it does both. It is effective because it is small enough that your self-protection mechanisms do not fully activate. The threshold is low enough to step over without drama, and stepped over enough times, that threshold eventually disappears. Here is what I want you to walk away with. One clear thing. You do not burn out from learning too much. You burn out from learning in the wrong shape. The right shape is small, specific, consistent, and kind. It respects your brain's actual architecture. It treats mastery not as a destination you sprint toward, but as a direction you keep walking, calmly, one clear step at a time. The Feynman technique, the memory palace, deliberate practice, none of these change the fundamental truth that real understanding is built slowly, in layers, through honest engagement with what you do not yet know. The method is not magic. You are not magic. But the relationship between them, when it is honest, is quietly extraordinary. If something in this video felt familiar, the frustration, the plateau, the invisible pressure to be further along than you are, I want you to know that's the right place to start. Not from strength, not from confidence, but from clarity about where you actually are. In the next video, I want to go deeper into something this one only touched on. Why so many people who are genuinely intelligent still feel like frauds when they try to learn something new. It's not imposter syndrome in the way you've probably heard it described. It's something older and more interesting than that. If that question sits with you, stay close. There's more to explore.